The crash was violent, even by interstellar standards. Elias Ward barely remembered the moments before the celestial horizon slammed into the barren surface of Frentis 9. The alarms had screamed, the inertial dampeners failed, and the last thing he saw before impact was the jagged landscape rushing up to meet the ship. When Elias regained consciousness, it was to a world of pain and smoke. He lay half-buried under a collapsed bulkhead, his body pinned at an awkward angle. Every breath felt like dragging in molten steel, and a dull, throbbing ache in his leg told him something was very wrong. Blood trickled down his temple, stinging his eye. The emergency beacon's faint strobe pulsed weakly, barely visible through the haze. The air reeked of scorched metal and burning fuel. Elias coughed, a wet, rattling sound that sent fresh waves of agony through his chest. Above him, through the haze, shapes appeared, tall, angular figures silhouetted against the flickering flames. Their movements were purposeful, their voices sharp and unfamiliar. He squinted, trying to focus, but his vision blurred. "He's here," one of them said, her voice sharp and melodic. "Vitals are weak, severe trauma to the thoracic and lower extremities, hemorrhaging detected." Another figure, broader and covered in glimmering emerald scales, crouched beside him. A clawed hand reached out to assess the beam trapping him. "It's crushing his lower body. If we don't remove it, he'll bleed out." Elias groaned as the voice washed over him. "Bleed out," he muttered, the words slurring together. "Sounds bad." The lavender-skinned figure leaned closer, her face glowing faintly in the dim light. "Can you hear me? We're here to help." Elias blinked at her, his head lolling to one side. I'm fine," he rasped, though every word was a struggle. The medic's glowing veins pulsed as her brows furrowed. "He's delirious. Blood oxygen levels critically low. Prepare the stabilization field." "Move the beam first," the scaled figure said. "He's losing blood faster than we can contain it." Vanali, the lead medic, hesitated only for a second before nodding. Together, the team maneuvered a mechanical lifter to hoist the twisted bulkhead off Elias. The moment the weight shifted, Elias's body spasmed in response, a strangled cry escaping his lips, his pale face twisted in pain. "Vitals crashing," Vanali snapped. "Prepare the vascular stasis injectors now." The injectors hummed as they pressed them into Elias's exposed skin, releasing a glow that slowed the immediate bleeding but did little to ease his suffering. He coughed again, blood spattering his lips, and tried to lift a hand. "Relax," Vanali ordered, her tone sharp. "Don't move. You're gravely injured." "Yeah, no kidding," Elias slurred, his eyelids fluttering. "But seriously, I've had worse." "He's incoherent," Kivrin muttered. "Can humans truly be this obstinate?" "Not obstinate," Vanali said grimly as she worked to seal the bleeding in his side. "Delirious. His oxygen deprivation is severe." Elias didn't remember being lifted into the alien transport. When he next opened his eyes, he was surrounded by sterile white light and a soft hum that pressed against his ears like static. His body felt heavy, his limbs unresponsive. A sharp tug in his chest accompanied every shallow breath. The slightest movement sent jolts of pain through his ribs and legs. "Patient conscious," a voice said, faintly familiar. "Increase oxygen delivery. We need him stabilized enough to survive the next phase." Elias tried to focus on the speaker, but the light hurt his eyes. "Doc?" he murmured. "What's happening? Happening?" "You're aboard the Civion," Vanali said, her tone clipped. "We extracted you from the crash site. You're critical but alive." "Critical, huh?" Elias rasped. "That's red, right?" "Extremely," Vanali snapped. "Do you understand the severity of your condition? Your leg is shattered, your lungs are compromised, and you've lost a dangerous amount of blood. If we don't act quickly—" I know," Elias interrupted, his voice trailing into a faint wheeze. "I'm fine." "You're not fine," Vanali replied sharply. She turned to Kivrin, who was calibrating a vascular stabilizer. "His oxygen levels are still plummeting. We're running out of time." Elias blinked slowly, as though her words were drifting to him from underwater. Plummeting sounds. Bad, too. You're delirious, Vanali muttered, more to herself than to him. Just focus on breathing, don't talk. Despite her command, Elias couldn't seem to stop. You know, he slurred. I've been worse off. Once. Got caught in a maglift collapse. Broke. Everything. Crawled out. Took hours. Venali exchanged a look with Kivrin, her glowing veins flickering with exasperation. Does he even hear himself? I'm inclined to believe he's hallucinating, Kivrin replied. Hallucinating, Elias croaked. Just a little winded. Winded, Vanali snapped, her frustration boiling over. Your vitals are a disaster, and your blood pressure is... She stopped, taking a calming breath. Arguing with him was pointless. Her team continued working with precision, but the equipment struggled to keep up with the complexity of Elias's injuries. Tissue regenerators only partially repaired the damage to his chest before the strain overloaded them. The vascular stasis fields slowed his bleeding but couldn't stop it entirely. Through it all, Elias drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally mumbling disjointed phrases. At one point, he stirred enough to wince visibly, his expression tightening. That's new, Kivrin remarked. Is he finally registering the pain? Vanali scanned him again, her tone grim. The oxygen levels are improving slightly, but he's still unstable, and yes, he's starting to feel it. As if on cue, Elias let out a low groan, his voice hoarse and strained. This hurts. Vanali stepped closer, meeting his bleary gaze. It should. You're in critical condition, and the only reason you're alive is because of our intervention. Do you finally understand how serious this is? Elias tried to nod, but the motion turned into a grimace. Yeah, okay. Not fine, he admitted weakly, not even close. Good, Vanali said, her tone softer now. Now, let us do our job. By the end of the first cycle, Elias's condition remained precarious. His oxygen levels had improved marginally, but his body was still under immense strain. Vanali sat beside his bed, studying his uneven breathing and pale complexion. He's not out of danger yet, she murmured to Kivrin, who stood nearby. Humans are more resilient than they appear, Kivrin said, though his tone was cautious. Still, I've never seen one this stubborn. Vanali glanced at the monitors, her glowing veins dimming with fatigue. Let's hope his resilience holds out a little longer. The medbay aboard the Civion hummed with quiet urgency. Vanali leaned over Elias Ward's bed, scanning his vitals for what felt like the 100th time. The human had stabilized just enough to cling to life, but his condition was far from secure. His oxygen levels had risen slightly, allowing his delirium to recede, but the cost was his growing awareness of the pain. Elias stirred, a faint groan escaping his lips. His face was drawn, pale beneath the harsh white light. He blinked up at Vanali, his gaze clearer than before but clouded with exhaustion. Hey, Doc, he murmured, his voice low and ragged. You're still here? Yes, Vanali replied curtly, her glowing veins flickering faintly. And you're still alive, though not for lack of effort on your part. Elias managed a faint chuckle, though it quickly turned into a grimace. You make it sound like I'm trying to die. You're certainly making it difficult for us to prevent it, Vanali shot back. She motioned to Kivrin, who adjusted the stabilizer fields, humming around Elias's body. You're more coherent now. That's progress. How do you feel? Like I've been run over by a freighter, Elias replied, his tone serious but tinged with dry humor. Chest feels tight. Legs killing me. That's because your ribs were puncturing your lung and your femur was crushed under a structural beam, Vanali said bluntly. Both injuries have been partially addressed, but the damage was severe. Elias winced, shifting slightly. The movement sent a jolt of pain through his body and his breath hitched. Okay, yeah. Not great. Good, Vanali said. Acknowledging your condition makes it easier for us to treat you. Delirium can only explain so much. Elias closed his eyes for a moment, taking shallow breaths. Guess I owe you for the patch job. Vanali arched an eyebrow. You owe us much more than that. Without intervention, you would have died within minutes. Yeah, well, Elias muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. I appreciate it, even if it hurts like hell. Despite the small improvements, Elias's recovery was anything but smooth. The internal bleeding had slowed, but hadn't stopped entirely, and his oxygen levels remained volatile. Every few hours, alarms would chirp as his vitals dipped unexpectedly, sending the med team into action. He's stable enough for surgery on the leg, Kivrin said, studying the latest scan. The fractures are severe, but the stabilizers have held. Vanali frowned. It's risky. His body is already under enormous strain. Risky or not, if we don't realign the bone, it could cause further complications, Kivrin insisted. As they prepared for the procedure, Elias groaned again, his eyes fluttering open. What's going on? He asked, his voice groggy. You're stable enough for us to address your leg, Vanali explained. The fractures need to be realigned to prevent further damage. Elias blinked at her, his expression wary. Sounds unpleasant. It will be, Vanali admitted, but we'll use neural dampeners to minimize the pain. Elias's lips twisted into a weak smirk. Minimize, huh? Not eliminate? Our technology isn't designed for humans, Vanali said, her tone edged with frustration. Be grateful we can do anything at all. Elias nodded faintly, his face pale but determined. All right, Doc, do what you gotta do. The procedure was grueling. Despite the neural dampeners, Elias's body reacted violently to the pain, his muscles tensing and his heart rate spiking. Vanali worked with precision, her hands steady even as sweat beaded on her brow. Kivrin monitored the stabilizers, adjusting them constantly to keep Elias's vitals from crashing. When it was over, Elias was drenched in sweat, his breathing labored. Vanali stepped back, her glowing veins dim with exhaustion. The fractures are aligned, and the stabilizers are holding, she said, her voice tight. He'll need regenerative therapy to fully heal, but this was the most critical step. Elias let out a shaky breath, his voice barely audible. Thanks, Doc. Even if it feels like I've been hit by a plasma cannon. You've been through worse, haven't you? Vanali asked, her tone laced with dry sarcasm. Elias managed a faint grin, though his eyes were heavy with fatigue. Sure, but this one's, pretty high up on the list, Max explained. The hours that followed were tense but marked by small victories. Elias's vitals began to stabilize, his oxygen levels climbing steadily into safer ranges. For the first time, the alarms remained silent, and Vanali allowed herself a moment to exhale. Elias stirred again, his gaze clearer than before. The pain was still evident in his expression, but his voice was stronger. How's the patient, Doc? He asked, his tone faintly teasing. You're alive, Vanali replied, folding her arms. Beyond that, it's too early to celebrate. Elias nodded slowly. Fair enough. Still feels like I got off easy. Vanali's glowing veins flared with irritation. Easy? Do you have any idea what we've gone through to keep you alive? Yeah, Elias said softly. And I'm grateful. Just don't tell anyone, okay? Gotta keep my reputation. Kivrin, standing nearby, let out a low rumble of disbelief. Humans are truly baffling. They are, Vanali agreed, though her tone had softened. She glanced at Elias, who had drifted into an uneasy sleep, his breathing finally steady. But somehow, they endure. Elias Ward's recovery continued to teeter on the edge of chaos. While the alignment of his fractured femur was holding, the regenerative therapy was slow to take effect, and his body remained in a precarious state. The vascular stabilizers kept his internal bleeding under control, but his oxygen levels fluctuated unpredictably, a constant source of anxiety for the Civion's medics. Vanali sat at her workstation, reviewing the latest scans. The human's injuries were responding unevenly to Zerlanian technology, as if his body couldn't decide whether to cooperate or rebel against the treatments. She let out a long sigh, her glowing veins flickering faintly with fatigue. "He's improving," Kivrin said, his tone cautious, "but not quickly enough." "He's alive, which is more than I expected when we found him," Vanali replied. "Though at this rate, I'm not sure if it's due to our intervention or sheer stubbornness." The two medics turned as a groan rose from the medbed. Elias shifted slightly, wincing as his leg moved against the support brace. His eyes fluttered open, and he blinked at them, his expression somewhere between groggy and annoyed. "You two talking about me again?" he rasped. "Only because you keep giving us reasons too," Vanali said, standing and approaching his bedside. "How are you feeling?" "Like a punching bag," Elias muttered, his voice clearer than it had been in days. "But I'm breathing, so progress?" "That's one way to look at it," Vanelli said, scanning him. "Your oxygen levels are stabilizing, but you're far from out of danger. Don't start thinking you can move around yet." Elias grunted, shifting his shoulders against the bed. "Believe me, Doc, I'm not planning on running any marathons." "Good," Vanali replied, "because if you try, you'll undo everything we've worked for." "Noted," Elias said. He closed his eyes briefly, his brow furrowing as a wave of pain passed through him. "Leg still feels like it's on fire, chest too." "That's expected," Vanali said, adjusting a monitor. "Your body is still in the early stages of recovery. The pain will persist for a while." Elias opened one eye, giving her a weak smile. "You're great at pep talks, you know that?" Vanali didn't rise to the bait. "Pain is a sign that your body is responding to treatment. It's unpleasant, but it's a step forward." "Unpleasant's one word for it," Elias muttered. "Feels more like getting stabbed repeatedly, but sure, let's call it progress." Despite his complaints, Elias's condition continued to improve incrementally. His oxygen levels remained steady, and the regenerative treatments began knitting his damaged tissues back together at a slow but measurable pace. The alarms that had once blared constantly now only sounded intermittently, and Vanali found herself cautiously optimistic. Still, the human's recovery was not without complications. One afternoon, as she was checking his vitals, Elias suddenly tensed, his breath hitching. His hands gripped the edges of the bed, and his face contorted in pain. "Elias?" Vanelli asked sharply, leaning over him. "What's wrong?" "Chest," Elias gasped, his voice tight. "Feels like it's caving in." Vanelli's glowing veins flared with alarm. She scanned him quickly, her hands moving with practiced precision. "His heart rate spiking," she said to Kivrin, who rushed over to assist. "Possible vascular strain." "Hold still," Kivrin said, pressing a stabilizer against Elias's chest. The device hummed softly as it released a faint glow. "This will help alleviate the strain." Elias groaned, his breathing shallow. "Yeah, feels great." "Stop talking and focus on breathing," Vanali ordered, her voice firm. "Your body's under enough stress without you making it worse." Elias managed a faint nod, though his jaw remained tight with pain. As the stabilizer took effect, his breathing began to even out and his heart rate slowed. Vanali let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Better?" she asked, her tone softer now. Elias nodded weakly, his face slick with sweat. "Yeah, better. Thanks, Doc." "You're not invincible, Elias," Vanali said, her voice edged with exasperation. "You have to tell us immediately if something feels wrong, do you understand?" Yeah, Elias muttered. "You don't have to yell." "I wasn't yelling," Vanali replied, though her glowing veins pulsed faintly with irritation. "But if you want to survive this, you need to take your condition seriously." For once, Elias didn't argue. He simply nodded, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. By the time Elias had recovered enough strength to sit up slightly in bed, the med bay felt almost serene compared to the chaos of the previous cycles. Vanali stood at the end of his bed, arms crossed as she reviewed his latest scans. "Your body is responding well to the regenerative treatments," she said. "The internal bleeding has stopped, and your lung function is nearly normal. The fractures in your leg will take more time, but the stabilizers are holding." Elias gave her a faint smile. "So, you're saying I'm not dying anymore?" "For now," Vanelli replied, though her tone carried a hint of dry humor. "But don't push your luck." Elias chuckled weakly, though the motion made him wince. "Not planning to, Doc. I'm not a complete idiot." Kivrin, who was observing from a nearby console, let out a low rumble. "Debatable." Elias grinned, his expression faintly mischievous. "You're warming up to me, big guy, I can tell." "Hardly," Kivrin replied, though there was no malice in his tone. Vanelli shook her head, suppressing a smile. "Rest. You're not out of the woods yet, and you'll need all your strength for the next stages of recovery." Elias nodded, leaning back against the bed. "Got it. Thanks, Doc." Vanelli turned away, her glowing veins dimming as she allowed herself a moment of relief. For all his stubbornness and reckless humor, Elias was proving to be as resilient as she'd suspected. Maybe, just maybe, he'd make it through this after all. Elias Ward's road to recovery was still long and riddled with obstacles, but the crisis had finally passed. The medbay aboard the Sivion was quieter now, the alarms no longer wailing at irregular intervals, and the hum of the stabilizers had become a steady background rhythm instead of a desperate fight against time. Elias had made it through, but as Vanelli reminded him daily, he wasn't out of the woods just yet. Rest was his prescription, and a lot of it. When he woke that morning, the sterile light of the medbay felt less oppressive, and the sharp edge of pain that had accompanied every breath had dulled to a manageable ache. He shifted slightly, testing the limits of his mobility, and let out a quiet groan. His leg was still encased in the support brace, and his chest felt like it had been packed with gravel, but he could breathe deeply again without coughing up blood. That alone felt like a small miracle. "Don't move too much," came Vanelli's voice. She appeared at his bedside, holding a scanner and a data pad. Her glowing veins pulsed softly, reflecting her calmer mood. "Your ribs are healing, but they're not ready to handle your stubbornness." "Morning, Doc," Elias said, his voice hoarse but steady. "You know, I think I'm getting used to waking up to your cheery bedside manner." "I'm not here to be cheerful," Vanelli said dryly. "I'm here to ensure you don't undo all the work we've done." Elias grinned faintly, his usual mischief tempered by his lingering exhaustion. "Guess that means I'm doing better if you're already nagging me." Vanelli ignored the comment and began scanning his chest, her expression unreadable. After a moment, she nodded. "Lung capacity is back to acceptable levels, and your oxygen saturation is holding steady. The internal injuries are healing as expected." "So, good news?" Elias asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yes," Vanelli admitted, though her tone remained cautious. "But don't mistake progress for being fully recovered. Your body has been through severe trauma, and it still needs time to repair itself." Elias sighed, leaning back against the pillows. All right, no running marathons, no lifting heavy things, I got it." "Good," Vanelli said, her gaze softening slightly. "Because if you try, I'll personally sedate you." Elias chuckled weakly, though it quickly turned into a wince. "Noted. You're scary when you mean it, Doc." The rest of the day passed quietly, though boredom quickly set in for Elias. He spent most of the time lying in bed, watching the Zerlanian medics as they worked on other patients or reviewed data. Occasionally, Kivrin stopped by to check on him, his hulking presence a stark contrast to the smaller, more precise movements of Vanelli. "Still breathing, I see," Kivrin said as he approached the bed. "Barely," Elias replied with a smirk. "But thanks to you guys, I might just make it." "Don't get ahead of yourself," Kivrin rumbled, though there was a faint trace of amusement in his tone. "Your species has an unnerving habit of pushing limits when you shouldn't." "Hey, it's a gift," Elias said, shrugging as best he could without aggravating his ribs. "What can I say? Humans are built for chaos." "Chaos is one way to describe it," Kivrin replied, shaking his head. "Recklessness is another." Vinali appeared moments later, holding a small tray with what looked like a nutrient solution. If you're done philosophizing about humanity's flaws, Kivran, he needs to eat. Kivran stepped aside, muttering something under his breath as Vinelli placed the tray on the bedside table. Elias eyed the solution with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "What's this?" he asked. "Your first step toward regaining strength," Vinali said. "It's a concentrated nutrient formula, easy to digest, full of what your body needs." Elias grimaced. "Looks like sludge." "It's effective," Vinali replied, ignoring his protest. "And it's all you're getting for now." With a resigned sigh, Elias picked up the small cup and took a cautious sip. His face twisted, and he let out a low groan. "Tastes like sludge, too!" "Stop complaining and drink," Vinali said, her glowing veins flaring faintly. "Unless you'd prefer to be hooked up to an IV for the next cycle." Elias muttered something under his breath, but complied, finishing the cup in a few slow gulps. When he was done, he leaned back, his expression one of reluctant acceptance. "All right, Doc, you win, but only because I'm too tired to argue." "Good," Vinelli said with a faint smile. "Rest now. Your body needs it." As the days passed, Elias's condition continued to improve. The sharp pains in his chest faded to a dull ache, and the deep throbbing in his leg became more tolerable. The regenerative treatments had worked wonders, but as Vinali reminded him, his recovery wasn't just physical. He needed to let his body adapt to the repairs, a process that required patience, a quality Elias wasn't known for. One afternoon, Vinali caught him trying to sit up more than the bed's supports allowed. She immediately stepped in, her voice sharp. "What do you think you're doing?" "Just testing the waters," Elias said, wincing as he eased himself back down. "Can't lie around forever, Doc." "You'll lie around as long as I say you need to," Vinali replied firmly. "Do you want to undo all the progress we've made?" "No," Elias admitted, his tone subdued. "Just getting restless?" Vinali sighed, her irritation softening. "I understand, but your body isn't ready yet. Rest is as important as the treatments." "Yeah," Elias said quietly. "I get it. I just hate feeling useless." Vinali tilted her head, studying him for a moment. "You're not useless. You survived something that should have killed you. That resilience is remarkable, even if it's frustrating for us." Elias looked at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Was that a compliment?" "Don't let it go to your head," Vinali said, turning away before he could respond. By the end of the cycle, Elias was sitting upright in his bed, his color returning and his voice stronger. He still tired easily, and every movement had to be slow and deliberate, but the worst was behind him. "All right, Doc," he said as Vinali approached with her scanner. "Be honest." "How much longer am I stuck here?" "Longer than you'd like," Vinali said, her glowing veins pulsing faintly as she scanned him. "Your injuries were catastrophic. Recovery will take time." Elias sighed, but nodded. "Fair enough, but you've got to admit, I'm doing better." "You are," Vinali admitted, "but don't mistake that for being ready to leave. You'll need weeks of rest and monitored care." Elias grinned faintly. "Weeks, huh? Guess that's better than the alternative." "It is," Vinali said, her tone softening. "And for what it's worth, you've handled this better than I expected." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Another compliment?" "Careful, Doc, I might start thinking you like me." "Don't push your luck," Vinali replied, though there was a faint smile on her face. As Elias settled back into his bed, the hum of the med bay around him felt less oppressive. For the first time since the crash, he allowed himself to believe he might just be okay.